very unused to it. I generally speak face to face with people, and it's a much different experience to talking over the internet because essentially at the moment all I can see is my PowerPoint and Kim down there in the corner. So hopefully you don't all doze off or leave the room or start throwing things at your computers in response to what I'm saying. Hopefully I can keep you engaged and entertained. So yeah, firstly, thank you to Rhiannon and Kim and Up2Us Landcare for giving me this opportunity to speak with you. I'm coming to you today from Yuin country in southeast New South Wales, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As Kim said, I'm a landscape planner with the Mulloon Institute. The Institute itself was established in 2011 by third generation jeweller Tony Coote. Tony's first love was in agriculture, and he had a vision to support research and education into regenerating landscapes. Tony wanted his 2 farms in the Mulloon catchment to become long-term living laboratories and living classrooms. And so Tony bequeathed both his farms to the Mulloon Institute so they couldn't be sold and so they could undertake that research into the very long term. So the story I'm going to share with you this evening actually begins in 2005, which is well before the Mulloon Institute existed. But first of all, I'm actually going to spend some time discussing some of the fundamentals of landscape rehydration and how these fundamentals have built and rebuilt the landscapes of planet Earth essentially over the millennia, and how we are applying these fundamentals in regenerating the landscape of the Mulloon catchment. So I'm primarily a water scientist. I'm fascinated by the dynamics of water. Water, of course, is fundamental to all life on Earth. The human body is 60% water. Yet water can also be one of nature's most destructive forces. Floods, cyclones, tsunamis, mudslides, avalanches, ice ages. The surface of the planet has been made by water. Water is the hammer and chisel that the universe has used to make planet Earth. Now, I say this because it is the forces of the universe, the forces of nature, that drive the water cycle. This coupling has the power to erode whole catchments, whole continents to the sea. Only when you add a third element to this equation does the situation in any way reverse itself. And that is the complex web of life. And primarily it's plant systems, which account for 80% of all the biomass on the planet. A distant second at 15% is bacteria. And so the first part of my talk will be about these 3 elements, energy, water and life, and how they interact to either build or degrade landscapes. And so we define landscape rehydration as taking actions that encourage the retention and cycling of water in the landscape for the benefit of farm productivity and biodiversity. And so looking at the first element, which is energy, the laws of thermodynamics are basically considered the fundamental laws of nature. The first law and the second law of thermodynamics. The first law says energy cannot appear or disappear. It can only be transformed, transferred and transformed. Now, Brian Cox, a famous physicist, will tell us that there's 5 fundamental forces of nature. We're only going to talk about 2 of those, which are solar energy or electromagnetic energy and gravity. And these are the fundamental forces that are of greatest concern to us. So if you take solar energy, for example, it's transferred from the sun and it's transformed into a variety of other forms of derived energy, including biomass, which includes us. And so we are quite literally transformed solar energy. And it is plants that transform that solar energy, that electromagnetic energy, into chemical energy. otherwise known as biomass. Entropy, and I'm gonna continue to kind of refer and come back to these sort of laws as I discuss as I go through the presentation. The second law, which is the law of entropy, says that essentially the universe is heading towards a state of total chaos. It's a bit of a depressing law. No matter what we do, that's what's going to end up is total chaos. Other elements associated with the second law is that basically the universe is cooling. All of the heat and the energy of the universe is dissipating out into it, and it's cooling down. And another fundamental in that is that a warm body will always move towards a cool body, not the other way around unless there's an input of energy. And that's a sort of a key consideration that I'm going to be discussing as I go through this presentation as well. And so the only thing that's actually standing in the way of entropy is life itself. It is the only entity that we know of in the universe that actually captures energy and builds complexity rather than chaos. And another key thing about entropy is that the hotter things become, the faster entropy progresses. And so this is a bit of a concern when we consider climate change and the heating of the planet, because the hotter things become, the faster entropy happens, the more chaotic things become. I won't spend too much time on this. I do tend to spend a bit of time on thermodynamics, but I call the second law the law of entropy, like the raw prawn law. If you think about a raw prawn left in the sun, it's going to go off pretty quick. But if you put that in the freezer, it'll last for months. And so it basically says that, the warmer something is, the faster it's going to go off. So the cooler it is, the more the longer it'll be preserved. And so now I want to talk about briefly the thermodynamic properties of water. Water has the highest heat capacity of any known substance. In other words, it has the greatest ability to resist heating and resist cooling. So it requires something like 4 kilojoules of energy to increase 1 litre of water by 1 degree. Water also changes phases, and as a result of its phase changing, a major amount of energy is exchanged. As water heats up and evaporates, energy is absorbed, and as water condenses and cools down, energy is released. So for a kilogram or a litre of water vapor, it can hold nearly 2,500 kilojoules of energy, which is about a quarter of an average adult's energy needs every day. So it's an amazing amount of water of energy that water absorbs and releases as it cycles through its 3 phases of solid, liquid, and gas. Water vapor is lighter than air. So as a liquid, obviously it's heavier than air. It's subject to gravity, but the vapor itself, the water molecule, is one of the lightest molecules and constituents of the atmosphere. And so it's essentially able to defy gravity when it's a gas. And that's how come it's able to drift up into the upper atmosphere and form clouds. And even more amazingly, splitting of the water molecule by sunlight is what actually drives photosynthesis. It's the reaction called electrolysis, which is exactly the same reaction that Twiggy Forrest is going to harness to make abundant hydrogen for the future of our energy needs. Using solar energy, green hydrogen will be made through the process of electrolysis, which is the first part of the process of photosynthesis. There's a lot more about the thermodynamic properties of water, but that'll do me for now. And so getting back to energy, we're looking at electromagnetic energy here, energy from the sun. 180,000 terawatts comes from the sun every second of every day. That's 180 million gigawatts, which is 10,000 times the amount of energy that is used by all of humanity. And so that's a colossal amount of energy. And somehow planet Earth needs to manage that energy. Otherwise, it's basically going to fry. And the way it does that is partly through mainly through the water cycle. And as you can see, there's a bit of a breakdown of what happens to that solar energy when it's within the Earth's atmosphere, warms the land, drives the water cycle, drives winds and currents, ocean currents, and also 34% of it is reflected off the Earth's surface or its clouds via the albedo effect, which is essentially water as well, in either its gaseous or its solid phase, acting on sunshine and solar energy to manage the temperature of the surface of the Earth. As you can see down the bottom there, only 0.1% is actually captured through photosynthesis and converted into biomass. And so the other 99.9% effectively has to leave the planet at the end of every day, otherwise the planet starts to heat up. And so the primary role of life is actually, and especially its plant systems, throughout the course of evolution, has actually been to dissipate these colossal natural forces that allow life to survive, so that life can actually survive and thrive. And in so doing, since life first emerged from the primordial soup 3.6 billion years ago, conditions have gradually improved on planet Earth, so that eventually the conditions have been such that they've been able to give rise to human beings. And so complex life on Earth quite literally creates a force field against the forces of the universe. And so this is the water cycle. You could think about it from a global perspective. And it's driven by solar energy and it's driven by gravity. And so most of the water that's evaporated off the oceans, as you can see, actually falls back into the ocean as rain. It is the major part of the water cycle, but the ocean basically keeps a lot of it to itself. And only 10% of ocean evaporation rains over the land. The balance of land-based rainfall, therefore, has to come from the land itself. And this is a really important part of the concept of landscape rehydration. And it's mainly from water that's transpired from the leaves of plants. If a landscape is cleared of its evaporative surfaces, vegetation, wetlands, then the landscape becomes hotter and drier. This is because it has lost the air conditioner effect of the evaporating water, which also reduces local humidity. Furthermore, reduced leaf surface area increases the desiccating effect of wind and direct sunshine, and also reduces the sites where moisture can actually precipitate. It becomes a positive feedback loop where the landscape gets less rain and becomes hotter. Also, hotter air will hold more water as vapor and needs to cool or become fully saturated before that water will condense into rain. It does this by drifting high into the atmosphere where it's cooler, or it will drift out over the oceans, which relative to the continents are becoming cooler. So the oceans aren't necessarily getting cooler, but the continents are getting hotter relative to the oceans. And so this brings us back to the second law of thermodynamics. A warm body will naturally move towards a cool body. If that's a warm body of air, it's likely to move towards a cool body of air, where it's then more likely to condense its moisture into rain. And so the continents warm up relative to the oceans, and we will see a greater loss of water to the oceans. So hydrated landscapes stay cooler and get more precipitation, which includes dew. And so that water cycle is the planet's air conditioner. As the planet sweats, i.e. water is evaporating from its surface, it's transforming and transporting huge amounts of energy in the form of latent heat into the upper atmosphere. Some of the heat that's released when the water condenses into rain creates part of the greenhouse effect that actually keeps the planet warm. It's actually pretty cold in space. The remainder of the heat dissipates back into space so we don't get too warm. This is a simplification of the previous slide. You have a large water cycle, which is the global water cycle, and you have the small water cycle, which is subcontinental, and even as small as a single watershed. And you have the daily water cycle, evaporation during the day, condensation often due at night time. Functional terrestrial ecosystems will retain and cycle water several times before that water makes its way back to the ocean. Functioning ecosystems will also retain and cycle nutrients, and they'll build carbon. So bringing it down to the paddock scale, a dry paddock will transform solar energy as heat you can feel. It'll basically turn it into heat, transform it into heat. And then that'll heat the atmosphere around it. A hydrated paddock with plenty of green surface area will transform solar energy into latent heat. And so this graphic that you see in front of you, it basically on average, 1,000 watts per square metre of solar energy is reaching the surface of the ground anytime the sun is shining through the clouds or during the daytime. And so if it's a dry landscape, 60 to 70% of that energy is going to be converted into sensible heat, which is going to heat the landscape around it and cause the consequences that I just discussed a minute ago. But if it's a hydrated landscape, green surface area, plenty of green surface area, then most of that energy is going to transform into latent heat, which is basically defined as heat, which for every unit of energy that's transformed into latent heat, there is no increase in temperature. And you get latent heat when water evaporates. And so literally water vapor is gobbling up all of this heat, this solar energy. And because as a vapor, it's lighter than air, defies gravity, it's heading back up into the atmosphere where it will eventually condense and fall back as rain. So how do the three elements of energy, the three elements of energy, water and life interact to influence how our landscapes look and function? Well, Australia's an old landscape. It's characterised by landscapes of low relief with broad alluvial valley floors and rolling hills. This slide depicts a once ubiquitous landscape scene on the tablelands and the slopes of eastern Australia. This is an intact valley floor with a chain of ponds meandering through the centre. And so it doesn't have a distinct channel, but as you can see, it's got a series of ponds stepping down through that valley. Now, those ponds themselves are just windows on the underlying groundwater. They're not like farm dams that'll just be dishes of water in the paddock. They are surface expressions on the underlying groundwater, which will express itself all the way across that valley floor and be quite close to the surface, which is what keeps the vegetation green. Now, the bottom slide, we're doing some measuring there of that particular pond that's in front of us. This is a property that my wife and I lease on the tablelands. And these ponds are quite deep in their natural state. That's a 3 metre deep pond. And so because it's also connected to the groundwater, that pond will stay much cooler than otherwise a farm dam would on a hot summer's day. It will be more in tune with the temperature of the subterranean landscape, this under the ground, which on the tablelands doesn't get much above 18 degrees. And so the temperature of that pond would be about 18 degrees. in the middle of summer, whereas an equivalent farm dam might be up to 30 degrees. So that has a major effect by itself on evaporation and water quality. Again, this is just another shot in the valley floor of a nice full pond with complex vegetation around it. This is an infrared shot of a intact chain of ponds system close to Mulloon in the Boro Creek catchment. And basically where you can see the red and orange, that's where it's green. And the dark features are the ponds in the landscape. Now this shot was taken in January 2014, which is still the hottest, driest month on record on the southern tablelands. It got to, I think it was 39 degrees on average right through the month, and we didn't get a drop of rain. So it was very, very hot. But this scene basically depicts that valley floor, which is several hundred hectares, remained green, remained cool, and remained fully hydrated. And so this is just a cross-sectional schematic of the floodplain valley floor systems that I've just been talking about. So in an intact state, you've got full ponds, you've got a high water table, you've got good surface roughness in the vegetation itself. And this would have been a ubiquitous situation 200 years ago throughout Australia in a lot of cases. You get a flood comes through or a pulse of rain, a pulse of water, and very quickly that water will spread out over the floodplain and it'll be a low energy braided flow. We introduced sheep and cattle 200 years ago when the Europeans came here, and they went straight to these valley floors because they were fertile, full of rich vegetation, green vegetation, plenty of water holes for them to drink, and they started to eat down the vegetation and increase the speed with which the water was able to flow through the landscape, because, you know, vegetation, grasslands especially, are very important in dissipating and spreading water flow through a valley. And then the landscape started to erode. These soft centres of these floodplains became quite deeply pugged by the grazing cattle, which channelized the flows and caused the landscape to erode, and then the water table dropped and these valley floors all began to dry out, and that's almost the ubiquitous situation today. And you know, these are very common around, certainly around the southern tablelands. I'm sure you've got a few of your own down in that part of the world, nice deep erosion gullies, which, as you can see, the surface of this particular gully, even though it's a fragile soil, it's a pretty nice topsoil if it had been intact. And so we've gone from an intact valley floor system to an incised valley floor system, where whenever you get a downpour of rain, rather than it being a spreading low energy flow, it's a high energy torrent which comes quickly and goes quickly, and carries a lot of your nutrients and your soil with it, and leaves and doesn't do anything for the hydration of the landscape either. And so this is basically what we call flow duration curve. It's a simulation where on the left-hand side you've got a channelized system like a stormwater drain system. You've got very high rapid flow peaks, and then it drops very quickly. So that pulse of water moves through very quickly and it's very high energy. Whereas in an intact situation, you get a much lower peak and a much longer tail on your flow. So not as much water is going through the system. You might be holding up a little bit, but you know, that water is then able to trickle out as conditions dry out again, because you've got a hydrated landscape and plenty of water banked in that landscape. And so now I'm going to move on to you know, the project itself. And the people you see in front of you, Tony Coote and Peter Andrews, they're basically the instigators in the beginning of the what became the Mulloon Rehydration Initiative, which had its genesis back in 2005. And it was when Peter Andrews was invited to Mulloon Creek by Tony Coote, and they decided that they were pretty keen to work with each other to repair the valley floor in the floodplain pocket that was within the home farm, one of Tony's two properties. And the aim was to basically rebuild the function of that floodplain pocket. So the Mulloon Creek Valley itself, it's 23,000 hectares, and it comprises a series of floodplain pockets that step down through the valley. These floodplain pockets have been described, as I've said, as containing discontinuous watercourses, i.e. not a single continuous channel. So as part of the process, now, this was a project that occurred on one property initially, but it had the potential to at least create perceived effects for the neighbours and for the catchment community. So it was important to inform and involve the neighbours. So Tony contacted all of his neighbours, as well as the Up2Us Landcare Network and the Southern Rivers Catchment Management Authority, to garner support for what was called a natural sequence farming demonstration on his property. And there were certainly reservations from a couple of the landholders, a couple of the neighbours, about how the proposal might affect water availability downstream. But otherwise, it was given broad community support, and the Southern Rivers Catchment Management Authority agreed to play a supervising role. So in 2006, the demonstration was established with the help of the National Landcare Program. Now, this image that you see in front of you is a high resolution three-dimensional LiDAR image of the floodplain pocket in which the original demonstration was established. So less than 200 years ago, the stream running through this floodplain pocket was discontinuous. 200 years ago, it did not have the single continuous channel that you can see in this image at the moment. It was a chain of pond system with multiple flow paths, both superficial and subterranean. And so you can see lots of features in this picture which are really kind of interesting anyway. Obviously, you can see the central channel running down through the middle, which is basically an erosion gully. In some cases, that is up to 10 metres deep now, running through that floodplain pocket. You can also see tributary features. There's alluvial fans, for example, coming out of the side of the hills. I don't know if you can see my cursor there. This here is a really nice alluvial fan that's extending out from this particular tributary onto the floodplain, and there's another one there. And so these are also really interesting alluvial features that in a certain way are floodplains themselves. And there's also lots of other little features in the floodplain that you can see, such as these braids, these runnels, which are the former high flow paths when the creek did flow and before it was channelized in the way it is today. And so the demonstration involved the construction of many bed control structures, which are represented by these chevrons up through the main channel and also up into the tributaries themselves. One of the key processes that when you get the erosion of the main channel in these alluvial settings, the bed level drops, as I said, by up to 10 metres sometimes. And then that actually initiates erosion up into the tributaries as well. So the whole system basically erodes as soon as you pull the plug at the bottom of these floodplain pocket systems. The erosion works its way up the trunk stream and up the tributaries. And so this project basically was putting the plugs back into the system and aiming to bring the water level back up again and to slow down and to spread that water out more effectively. And so there were many challenges during the implementation of this project, but in the end, a successful outcome was achieved as it related to restoring the function of the creek itself. You can see some of the results there that we've accounted for. There's definitely more consistent stream flows leaving this floodplain pocket, so we haven't pinched water from downstream. We've actually made that flow more reliable. Um, the carrying capacity has increased on the floodplain as well because the water level has raised somewhat. The pastures and the vegetation is able to access the groundwater more effectively. There's greater resilience, therefore, to droughts and floods, less energy as the floods are able to spread out more water retained in the system during droughts for the benefit of the agricultural enterprise and also the biodiversity itself, and a dramatic increase in biodiversity that was, well, we virtually took it from nothing but weeds to now being complex enough in its vegetation assemblages that we're starting to actually introduce frog species that are extinct in the wild. And yeah, there's some really exciting possibilities there. And of course, we've moderated the microclimate as well due to that, hydration effect as well. And so these are just some pictures of the system prior to works and a few years ago. That was actually during the drought as well back in 2018, and yet we've got a beautiful pond system going on at that point. This is another shot that shows the structure that's gone in back in 2006, and that structure's effectively invisible now. And so with the limited monitoring there was of the pilot project, we've been able to get some insight to the hydrological, the agricultural and the ecological outcomes of the project. So in 2011, Tony established the Mulloon Institute to support research, education and advocacy that integrates agriculture and the environment. And in 2014, Tony wanted to go big with the demonstration, and so he invited all the other landholders effectively into the tent, albeit with some of the neighbours still having concerns. All the landholders along a 50-kilometre stretch of Mulloon Creek and its tributaries agreed to participate in a catchment scale project now known as the Mulloon Rehydration Initiative. The project would involve over 20 landholders across much of the catchment. It would be fully benchmarked and include a long-term monitoring program that would provide insights to regenerating degraded landscapes with strategic interventions and adapted farm management. A central tenet of the initiative was to address the ongoing erosion within the catchment, and in particular to re-establish the functional connection between the creeks and the gullies and their associated floodplain pockets. A combined area of several thousands of hectares just of alluvial landscape. And so the overarching research question for the Mulloon Rehydration Initiative is what is the effect of stream interventions on the ecology and farm productivity of the landscapes within the Mulloon catchment? Mulloon Institute's got a science advisory committee, which includes all number of scientists, you name it, they're on it. I won't go through them. And it's overseeing the setup of this triple bottom line monitoring framework that will hopefully answer many of the biophysical and social questions that this project poses. And so, as I said before, a key aspect is to understand the actual lie of the land. Now, this is another three-dimensional LiDAR image of Lower Mulloon now. You can see the natural sequence farming demonstration in the bottom corner there. This is Lower Mulloon floodplain, and it's 1,000 hectares. And again, it was a discontinuous system 200 years ago, which now has this continuous channel going right through the middle of it. So in the past, high flows would have spread out It would have been low energy, and all of those runnels that you can see in the picture on either side of the main erosion gully would have slowly transported any high flows through this floodplain, while at the same time catching any sediments and nutrients and allowing them to cycle. Yeah, so a key goal of this project has been to begin to raise the level of the creek again so that the energy of high flows can once again dissipate across a greater area rather than be concentrated within a narrow, deepening trench. And in so doing, multiple benefits will emerge. And if I go back to this slide, I've got them listed down there, which hopefully you've already read. And so with much surveying, planning, design and documentation to gain government approval, we've now installed a further 40 structures in the creek along a distance of 15 kilometres and across 5 more properties. Now this slide you see is a vertically exaggerated long section diagram that depicts the relative heights of each stream structure throughout a 3-kilometre stretch of Mulloon Creek on one property. A key consideration when siting and designing stream structures is the height difference between the ponds you are recreating. In this case, we can bring the whole stream up by about a metre in one go, provided the relative height between ponds is kept between about 300 and 500 millimetres. I'm about to show you an example of a structure that was built at the end of 2018 into part of the creek that was eroded to bedrock. You can see that the banks here are still actively eroding in this shot. So a strategically placed structure, a bunch of transplanted vegetation, some reseeding, and within 2 years, this is now a vibrant part of the creek system. And this is repeated throughout the system wherever we've undertaken this work. This is a slide of a drone shot taken of stage 1 of the Mulloon Rehydration Initiative. It was taken from above the King's Highway and it's looking upstream. The structure in the previous series of slides is at the bottom of the picture there. This stage includes 14 structures across 3 properties along 3.5 kilometres of creek. Yeah, they're depicted basically by those yellow ovals. Now note the greener tinge that's demarcating the floodplain boundary. It's early days yet, but our numbers are already starting to tell us that this could be due to the rehydration work within the creek. So this slide depicts Mulloon Creek one day after the biggest flood since 1974. The 1974 flood caused major erosion and changed the course of the creek. As a result of the recent creek works, this August 2020 event had the opposite effect. For the first time in 200 years, the 20 kilometres of creek where we had completed the works showed no signs of erosion, only deposition of nutrient-rich silt onto the floodplain. Thousands of tonnes of it. This is the same bit of creek 3 days later. And this is 5 weeks later. It's important to note that the creek structures have been placed at points where either the water would naturally have left the creek or naturally have re-entered the creek. If we go back to the flood shot, can you see all the braiding there? That's the natural pattern of the floodplain itself. And most of it's actually flowing away from the creek, from the main channel of the creek. And if you can see structures, there's a structure there, there's another structure up there where you can see the pines, and you can see how the water at that point is basically leaving the creek, and it's leaving the creek at several points between that structure and that structure. And there's another structure, well, essentially wherever the water is leaving the creek, is where we build a structure, and we built them there because that was in keeping with those natural patterns that we were trying to reinvigorate, essentially reconnect to. And that's a lovely scene. That's before our spring should even really start in on the southern tablelands in normal times. It's still in September, and we really don't have the last of our frosts until late October. And so we're already reaping the benefits, I think, of that event that's gone through, which would otherwise have been a destructive event. And so this, how much time have I got? I'm just about wrapped up, Kim. I'll just finish off with a couple more slides. This is just a hydrograph of Lower Mulloon. This is a stream from a stream gauge that's just upstream from that area that where I was showing the pictures of the flood. And it's a hydrograph between January 2020 and April 2021. And what it's depicting essentially is up until the beginning of February 2020, the creek was effectively dry. You know, that was the big drought at this particular point. And then we had a massive pulse that came through to put the fires out in February 2020 and rehydrate the creek. I've lost my cursor. Oh, there it is. Yeah. And so you see all these peaks are basically floods or pulses which have gone through the creek during this period. Now you see where the creek jumps up, the level of the creek jumps up in basically August 2020. That has happened because that's when we put the last of the structures in the creek down at Geralla, and we're able to immediately raise the water level 0.85 of a metre, nearly a full metre. And then this level here, the 1.39 metres, is when the flood came through on August the 10th. And the level of the hydrograph was not going to go any higher than 1.39 metres because that's when it spilled out on the floodplain. Now, the reason I've got these numbers against these peaks is because that is the rise in the water level above the previous base flow. And so you can see 1.5 metres here, 1.54 metres, 1.68 metres. And yet once we rebuilt the creek, the highest level before we're spilling over onto the floodplain is 1.39, and over here 1.41, which is only 2 centimetres higher. And so what this says that if the structures had been in the creek when the pulses, the floods first went through, the 1.5 metre peak, the 1.54 metre peak, and the 1.68 metre peak would have all spilt over the floodplain. Whereas because of the level of the creek at the time, they were confined within the channel, and that energy was confined within the channel itself. Anyway, I'll move on. Just to show you that it's not all about the valley floor, we're also doing work up in the hills as well. And basically our thinking is that we split the landscape into 3 zones. We've got our recharge zone at the top of the hill, our agriculture zone mid, slope to the bottom, and our filtration and recovery zone is basically our floodplains and our wetlands. And now we call the top of the hill the recharge zone is because that's where the fertility ought to be building. That's where biology through time immemorial has taken the fertility, taken the nutrients. If it was all just left up to the physical process, there'd be nothing on top of our hills. We wouldn't even have hills left, essentially. So it's physical processes take everything to the bottom of the hill. Biological processes are the only things that will take, your fertility back to the top of the hill again. And so to address that, what we do is, we build small contours to high in the landscape to capture water and to capture nutrients before it gets up to energy and starts heading down the slope. So we're able to cycle that water and use those nutrients higher up the hill. And we do a bunch of revegetation around this contour work as well, which is building carbon, which is providing habitat for the critters that are either flying up the hill or hopping up the hill to seek refuge. And you'll probably know, if any of you farmers in the room, that even herbivores are grazing animals. It's basically their instinct to camp high on the slope. Probably because they're looking at wanting to look out for predators. Also because it's a lot warmer up the hill than down the bottom of the hill. So we also use the behaviouralist approach to animal management to move our nutrients up the hill as well, just by encouraging them to camp high so they can eat low and camp high. And this is only 3 years after these plants were planted. This is early last year again, and they're thriving. And so if there is a big flow and water is going to spill out of these contours, it'll spill out of the contours on the ridges and then spread out as it goes down slope. And those are hill ponds, we call them. They'll capture the water, and then they'll capture the nutrients. They'll process it as well into a kind of a liquid form, if you like, so that it's far more available to plants as it's kind of released in the next pulse. And even though this is high on the hill, these ponds are already becoming pretty valuable frog habitat. It's actually quite amazing that they're staying filled with water. Well, it's easy for that to be happening at the moment because it's quite wet, but even during the drought, they were maintaining their water level. And this is just moving further out. You can see the contours snaking around the top of the hill. I only wish we'd continued to plant this hill out when we actually made the contours. These first contours were put in about 2017, but we're going to get on and just plant these contours right out over the next summer. And so that's about it for the presentation. So thank you very much, everybody. Nearly 7:30, but I guess there's a little bit of time to answer some questions for you. So I'll just get out of this PowerPoint and perhaps give the screen back to Kim.
Okay.
How does that sound?
Well, thank you very much for that, Peter. That was really, really interesting. It's great to look at the bigger picture and then bring it down to a landscape scale.
It's always hard to know whether people are just kind of glazing over. It's the first time I've actually presented the fundamentals of this via Teams. I normally do it in front of people, so if I can see people looking confused, I tend to give them a bit more explanation. So hopefully everyone's not bedazzled or confused or asleep.
Well, I can't see other people's faces either, but I know I found it very interesting. I did have a question. Those hill ponds that you had, were they naturally occurring, or had you put them?
No, we dug those.
You dug those, yep. So
we dig the contours, and they're small contours. They're not your classic kind of soil contour. They're a small contour, just in keeping with that part of the landscape, and they're built on the contour. So the main aim is that they soak the water into the ground, not allow the water to run. But if they do spill in a big event, then they'll spill out on the ridges. But if they're carrying any nutrients, any organic matter, that kind of thing, then they'll be captured in the ponds because it's a still water zone, and the nutrients are able to be processed or cycled back out of the pond again through that biological process.
Yep. Okay. We have a few questions that came in with the registrations. Nicole has said that we've just bought 22-acre property in Mansfield and we're wanting to learn as much as we can about improving our land. John has mentioned, has said, discuss the use of building levees to retain soil and moisture on small acreage with areas of surface rock. Yes, you got.
I've got those questions in
You've
front
got
of me
those questions
here.
here as well. Yeah.
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 Well, I don't know whether that presentation gave you any hints, Nicole, around how you might go about improving your land. Most certainly, ground cover is very important. You don't want water torrenting off your place. And really, it starts also with kind of getting a bit of a read on your landscape as well, understand where your particular property is positioned within a catchment watershed context. Whether it's got streams or gullies running through it, whether those gullies come from another person's property or not, how big the catchment is above your place, whether you have any alluvial kind of country on your property, which would have arrived there as a result of water in the first place and as a result of water de-energizing, because otherwise the sediments that water was carrying wouldn't have been able to drop out of that particular place. And in most cases, it's the vegetation. In all cases, in fact, it's the vegetation and that which creates the surface roughness, which dissipates the energy of those flows that enables your landscapes to build. And there's interventions such as contours you can put in, small contours, and they don't have to be even done with earthworks. I've built plenty of contours just with brush. Whenever I'm cutting or clearing vegetation out, scrubby vegetation, I'll just turn it into a contour by laying it out essentially, and that has quite an influence. Yeah, so there's a lot you can do. Do courses. Search the internet if you want to learn about how to improve your land. So building levees to retain soil and moisture on small acreage with areas of surface rock. Well, you can virtually use that rock. It's the same deal in a way. Rock is a brilliant material to make little rocky, leaky weirs in your gullies or your depressions. I've done that a lot too. A lot of work I've done on that property that you were looking at earlier with the intact chain of ponds. It did have eroded gullies, and I just go around and collect trailer loads of rock. If I had helpers, that was good, but a lot of it was just manhandled, and I'd find the appropriate parts of the landscape and start to build little leaky weir structures out of rock, essentially. And again, it's about dissipating, and spreading that water wherever water's concentrating. It has the potential to erode and to carry away your nutrients. So again, it comes back to reading your landscape. Look for your floodplain pockets, your alluvial fans, any your breaks of slope. Okay, the next question is from Jeremy. How does research tell us about the economic and animal health benefits of devoting swathes of your farmland, significant hectares removed from grazing areas, to plantations and filter dams? Well, in our case, they're not significant areas. They're actually very small areas. In fact, the riparian areas where we're undertaking the reconstruction of the valley floor will encourage the landholders in that project that we're undertaking to fence back as far from the creek as they feel comfortable with, so as they can get in behind that fence and more easily manage that riparian area behind the fence, because and treat it like another paddock. It's actually the most dynamic part of your landscape, and just because you fenced it and you're wanting to protect it, and especially protect the structures for, so as the landscape's able to rebuild, it doesn't mean that you can't graze that area. Also, you treat it like a paddock, and your livestock can be a very valuable tool in actually managing, various parts of your landscape if you're careful the way you do it. It's the same with forestry. Like you might exclude your your animals, your grazing animals from a given area for a certain period of time so that that area can recover, but there's no reason why they have to be excluded, permanently. In fact, it's a good idea if they're not excluded permanently, because you want to manage the vegetation, you want to manage that grass, the grasses, the biomass, and get it cycling. Do we have any sites in Victoria? Well, we're working on them actually. There's a few areas we've had a lot of interest from Victoria quite recently. Yeah, there's a lot of individuals doing these sorts of things in Victoria, but as yet, Mulloon Institute hasn't yet set up a demonstration. But we're talking with various catchment groups down on the Bass Coast, for example. Turnip Creek, have you ever heard of that? And if there's any interest in the Mansfield area for demonstrations, we can talk to you about that as well. And be more than happy to come down to your area and, walk around the paddock. It's always the best way to kind of talk about these things, actually. It's one of the limitations with the current situation is that we're having to do everything by Zoom and Teams. The way I normally do this is I'll come down, I'll talk to you, I'll bore the pants off you with a presentation like this, and then we'll get out into the paddock and spend the afternoon actually looking at the landscape and reading the landscape and understanding those patterns and processes. And, that would be the next step. If you're looking for a next step, up to us,
Yep.
that I would recommend.
Well, fingers crossed we can maybe do that in the new year.
Are there soil types? Do you have to knock off, or can I finish these last two questions?
We said we go till 7:45, so yeah, look, got it. 10 more minutes.
Okay. Well, the second last question from Damien's actually asked two questions. First one is, are there soil types or landscapes where you would not recommend leaky weirs or other structures within waterways? Yes, is the answer. And again, it comes down to reading the landscape. There's some landscapes that just, you don't want to disturb any more than they're currently disturbing in some ways. Or they might not be disturbed. They might actually be naturally repairing themselves as is. And so, we actually do take a bit of a minimalist approach and, do as little as possible to trigger those regenerative processes in the landscape. It's really about giving nature a bit of a hand, and then getting out of the way as much as possible, because nature is your ally here, and we found that if you can trigger the positive feedback loops in the positive direction, then nature very quickly starts to take over and starts to regenerate things itself. And that's an interesting point when it comes to our angle of attack. When I'm often asked, so where do you start when you want to sort of intervene in the system? And the answer is that we actually like to start high. You might start high on the slope, like the picture behind me, and get those fertility processes working up high, because gravity is going to start to take your fertility down slope, which is your nutrients, but it's also your biological fertility, your seeds and your that kind of biodiversity that's going to sort of seed the landscape behind you. And it's exactly the same in the creek. We started that project back in 2006 and rebuilt that floodplain pocket. And now that floodplain pocket, because it's upstream of all of the work that we're doing now in the Mulloon catchment, it's actually feeding the rest of the Mulloon catchment with nutrients, with organic matter, with water, with seeds. And so it's actually, nature is getting stronger all the time as it's sort of coming in behind us as we're doing the work. It's such a great thing to be part of. And Yeah, but look, there are risks. That's why we spend a lot of time, with our design work and with our planning work, so as we can mitigate those risks and, convince the authorities who are watching us pretty closely that we're not going to make a bigger mess than what we started with, because often these degraded soils are degraded because they're easily erodible. So yeah, what do you do as step one? Exclude stock from the waterway, construct structures, target eroded areas, etc. Step one, a catchment scale, it depends whether it's a catchment scale project or just a property scale project. If it's catchment scale, for example, step one is engaging with everybody, all the stakeholders, just kind of get everyone thinking and on the same page and understanding concerns and yeah, walking and talking and, starting to build a picture in people's minds as to, what landscape rehydration is all about. So, and that's really about what was the landscape like prior to it being the way it is today, if it happens to be degraded, which in most cases it is. And yeah, and just start to kind of bring people along for the journey, essentially. And if it's a single property, step one is, it's get out there and understand your landscape, read your landscape. Probably a lot of people will just want to jump in and do something. Let's build a contour, let's build a leaky weir. But you're better off just sort of actually trying to sort of refocus a bit, get some different eyes, and and watch the odd cycle go through. When I talk, say, cycles, wet cycles, dry cycles, the seasons, the winters and the summers and that sort of thing, and just start to understand how the patterns actually change over the course of a year or a couple of years in the landscape, and and go and learn a few things, I suppose, before you have a bit of a go. Tinker in a small way with a pile of rocks. That probably doesn't hurt. If you're going to do something that's not going to cause too much damage straight away. Yeah, any more questions?
Anyone else? Feel free to pop your microphone on if you have a question. No.
Hang on.
While
Jeremy's got his hand up.
Look, thank you. Thanks very much, Peter, for a terrific presentation, and thanks for answering my question earlier. We're not in floodplain country. Can you hear that all right?
Yes.
We're in foothills country, so our challenge, and one I raised with Andrews when he came to speak at Mansfield a few years ago, was how can we spread the water out easily from a lot of gullies? And so what we're trying to do is build filter beds around the dams we put in eroded areas, and then spread the water from the overflows out onto the paddocks. But it's tricky work, and we're really keen to rehydrate up on these hills. But do you have any particular tips for people like us who are in gully type country in the foothills?
Yeah. Yeah, again, it depends on steepness. It's always a bit of a challenge. But again, surface roughness, if you can establish and maintain that in some way, I mean, it might be the sort of country that lends itself to perhaps, laying down, brush rather than getting into it and digging it with a digger, with a tractor and a blade. Because a lot of steep country, I'll just do that if there's enough vegetation around. I used to have woofers a lot. I don't know if you probably heard of woofers, and they were so good because they just quite happily go out and spend a day just cutting brush and laying it out on the contour. It was very sort of simple and satisfying work, and I'll go back now into those areas and I'll lay more brush on top, because what happens is that that creates the microclimate that enables the grass to kind of grow a bit better, because it's being also protected from the herbivory of animals, wildlife or stock. but in so doing, the wildlife and stock are going to try and get in there and eat the sweeter grass, and they're going to trample that brush as it starts to break down. And so eventually the brush disappears, so you keep adding to it. And then this kind of natural kind of grassy contour starts to emerge, which also then catches, a lot of, if you've got a lot of kangaroos or wallabies around there, or native wildlife, or even sheep, they're dung around and they float. And so whenever you get a big event, it lifts up and washes down the hill pretty quickly. But, these brush contours that I built, they became very effective very quickly at capturing the dung of the animals, and that contributed to the fertility of the contour. And so, these things are just a way these days. It's really quite impressive, and then every year I'll just go back and I'll just throw another line of brush on them. You mentioned the dams. Did you say Peter Andrews came down there and gave you some advice some years back?
Yes, he spoke in Mansfield.
Okay.
He didn't come to our place, but he was good. He was mainly talking about places like you're talking about, which are more open country, where you could push a lot of scrub around and slow down the flow. But it was still interesting because what we're trying to do is fence up well above dams so that we're getting a kind of filter bed effect, and they're pretty rich. In fact, the cows try desperately to get in there, I'd have to say, because it's so lovely and rich. And the water is beautiful, and so we run water out to troughs instead of letting stock in. And some up on the sides of hills, we see quite a lot of rushes where there obviously been a bit of moisture, a bit of springs, so we've fenced a few of those off, and you get some nice little hillside ponds, as you mentioned. But a lot of the country still stays pretty dry.
Yep. Well, that's interesting in itself, that you say that there's some springs, because part of reading landscape, and this is sort of, courses help. Peter's son, Stuart, runs a course, 4-day course, Tarwin Park Training, where he introduces people over a 4-day period to, how you basically read your landscape and read those steps in the landscape, and things like springs. They're key features in even a steep landscape, and really the aim of doing contour work is really trying to simulate that very process. You're actually creating like a wetland step. You're trying to get a recharge going at a particular point, which is then going to create a discharge basically downslope fairly immediately, and that's why we're putting the vegetation in at that point, because we know we're going to get a really strong response from that vegetation too, because it's essentially being watered. And so again, this is part of, getting a read on your landscape, is sort of, seeing where those springs are, which are probably wetland steps, and just understanding, why they're there, and what the associated features are around it. And dams, sounds like you're getting a good outcome with your dam, but dams themselves are just mostly built as, water in one way and water out the other way, whereas they ought to be built with wetlands that are filtering the water before the water goes into that dam. And they also should be built so that when that dam is full, no more water actually goes into that dam. So we actually build dams that have got the same inlet as they have outlet. And we've usually run the water through the a wetland kind of area reeds and so forth before it flows into the dam. And then once the dam's full, the water doesn't go into the dam anymore, it just continues on down the slope. Look, there's all sorts of strategies depending on the sort of country you've got, and hard for me to make too much of a call unless I actually see it myself. Would it be similar to the country behind Kim's back there, the country that you're talking about, Damien?
Yes, look, it would be very similar to that. But look, thanks for that advice, and I'm not going to take up more of your time. We'd love you to come down this way one day to have a look at a number of properties. Really appreciated your time tonight.
You're very much more than welcome.
Yes, thank you. Well, it is 7:45 now. Are there any more questions, or is everyone all right to wrap it up? Yeah, hopefully you can get Peter down this way sometime soon. I would just like to say thank you so much for your time this evening, Peter. It was really interesting. I really, yeah, like I said before, like that, looking at the big broader scale and bringing it down to the landscape and that you're in, and it'll be really interesting. Just thinking of some hills and gullies around. It would be great to have a look at some time in the future. But as part of I mentioned before, this is funded through the National Landcare Program through the Golden Broken CMA, and our project that we have at Landcare is called Inspiring Small Farms to Grow Big Ideas. And this might be, Nicole before was talking about a 22-acre property. We're going to have a, hopefully in November, we will be able to get a group of people together out in the paddock and be able to meet on different people's properties and a bit of peer learning, and hopefully get people along to speak and look at regenerative farming practices and work and learn together. So if that's something you're interested in, please get in touch. And you'll see here in the comments I have added a form there. For these events to keep happening, we need feedback, and so please can you just take a minute to fill out that form, but I can email it out to everyone as well tomorrow. So yes. So Rhiannon, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Peter, for making the time to speak to us all tonight. It's been really interesting, and it's definitely got me thinking about hills and how we can improve our hill slopes and ways to reduce our erosion that we have quite a bit of in the region. Thank you so much. We hope to see you face to face soon.
Yeah, same here. Thanks very much for inviting me to talk.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Work together in the future. Yeah, it'd be great. All right. Have a nice evening.
Have a